The old cabin stood alone, weathered and wise against the backdrop of ancient pines that crowded the Montana wilderness. For decades it had witnessed the changing seasons, sheltering generations of the same family from winter's bite and summer's scorching heat. But on this particular autumn evening, something was different. The forest, usually alive with the symphony of birds and rustling leaves, had fallen eerily silent. Inside the cabin, furniture lay overturned. Claw marks scored the wooden walls, and strange, massive footprints pressed into the dust-covered floor. Something large had sought refuge here, something desperate, wounded, and not entirely human. What could make a creature of such legendary proportions break its code of isolation and seek shelter among the very beings it had avoided for centuries? The old pickup truck rumbled along the dirt road, swaying with each rut and divot carved by spring rains long since dried. Mason Harper gripped the steering wheel with weathered hands, his eyes fixed on the winding path ahead. At 58, his face had collected lines like the rings of a tree, each one marking seasons of joy, grief, and quiet contemplation. "How much longer, Dad?" Jake's voice piped up from the back seat, where the 12-year-old had been entertaining himself by cataloging wildlife spotted through the window. 20 minutes, same as when you asked 10 minutes ago," Mason replied, a small smile creasing his eyes without quite reaching his mouth. In the passenger seat, 17-year-old Ellie sighed without looking up from her book. "He's asked exactly 7 times since we left town, which statistically suggests he'll ask at least twice more before we arrive." Mason caught Jake sticking his tongue out at his sister in the rearview mirror. Despite everything, these small moments of normalcy warmed something deep within him. The trip to town for supplies happened only once a month, a necessary inconvenience in their otherwise isolated existence. The .30-06 rifle hung on its rack behind Mason's head, dusty and unused for years now. He'd stopped hunting after Sarah died, preferring to trade his botanical knowledge for meat with neighbors 15 miles down the mountain. The old rifle remained as a reminder of his former self, the man who'd tracked and studied forest creatures before retreating from the world of science and skepticism. "Storms coming in fast," Mason observed, nodding toward the darkening sky above the distant ridgeline. "Good thing we left town when we did." Ellie finally looked up, barometric pressures dropping. "I recorded it this morning. Suggests we might get cut off for a few days." "Yes," Jake pumped his fist. "No schoolwork." "Nice try," Mason chuckled. "You know the drill. Storm days are for extra reading." As they rounded the final bend, their cabin came into view, nestled among towering pines that had stood guard for centuries. Something in Mason's chest tightened, as it always did upon returning home, part relief, part gratitude for this refuge he'd built after leaving his academic career behind. "Something's wrong," Ellie said suddenly, her voice sharp. Mason slowed the truck, eyes narrowing. The cabin door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the rising wind. He'd locked it himself before leaving. He always did. "Stay in the truck," he ordered, bringing the vehicle to a stop at a cautious distance. "But Dad," Jake began. "Not negotiable." Mason's tone left no room for argument. He pulled the rifle from its rack, checking it quickly with hands that remembered the motions despite the years. "Lock the doors behind me." The familiar weight of the gun felt strange now, as Mason approached the cabin, moving with a deliberate quiet that returned unbidden from his tracking days. The surrounding forest had fallen unnaturally silent, no bird song, no squirrel chatter, nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles. Inside, chaos greeted him. Furniture overturned, shelves emptied, the old wooden table broken clean in half. But it wasn't the work of ordinary thieves. The destruction followed no logical pattern of someone searching for valuables. It was more instinctual, primal. Mason's breath caught as he noticed the footprints in the dust. Enormous, clearly defined, and unlike anything he'd seen in 25 years of wilderness study. His mind rebelled at the implications, even as his scientific training catalogued the details. When he returned to the truck, the children could read the tension in his shoulders. "Someone broke in?" Ellie asked. "Not someone," Mason replied, his voice deliberately steady. "Something, and judging by those tracks, it may still be nearby." Jake's eyes widened. "Like a bear?" Mason shook his head slowly, the old rifle hanging loose at his side. "No, son, not like a bear at all." Darkness settled over the cabin like a wool blanket, heavy and suffocating. The storm had arrived with unexpected ferocity, raindrops hammering against the roof like impatient fingers. Mason stood at the window, watching lightning illuminate the forest in brief, ghostly flashes. "I've never seen tracks like these," Ellie murmured, her pen moving swiftly across the pages of her leather-bound journal. By lamplight, she sketched the strange footprints with scientific precision, adding measurements and observations in her neat handwriting. "Too large for bear, wrong shape for moose. The stride length suggests something that walks upright." Jake hovered at her shoulder. "It's Bigfoot. I told you they were real. There's a rational explanation," Ellie insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Mason turned from the window. "Let's focus on what we know. Something broke in, took no valuables, but raided the food stores. It was injured. There's blood on the back porch steps." "How do you know it's still out there?" Jake asked, his voice small against the storm's percussion. "Animals seek shelter in weather like this," Mason replied, checking the locks again. "And whatever it is, it found shelter here once already." Dinner was a quiet affair by lantern light. Canned stew warmed on the wood stove since the power had gone out an hour after their arrival. The broken furniture had been pushed against one wall, the floor swept clean. On the surface, a semblance of normalcy, but tension hung in the air like static before a lightning strike. "When Mom was alive," Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence, "she used to tell me stories about forest guardians. Remember Dad?" Mason's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Sarah's stories, part folklore from her indigenous grandmother, part environmental lessons wrapped in mystery. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself to remember them? "I remember," he said softly. "She said they protected the forest and only showed themselves to people who respected the land." Jake's eyes shone in the lamplight. "Maybe that's why it came here. Maybe it knows we belong." Ellie closed her journal. "Mom's stories were metaphors, Jake. Ways to teach conservation principles through native traditions. Your mother believed in looking beyond the obvious explanation," Mason said, surprising himself with the words. "In her research and in life." The words hung between them, opening doors to conversations long avoided. Sarah's death 5 years ago had sent Mason retreating from his academic career and the ridicule that followed his controversial research papers. He'd brought the children to this remote cabin, ostensibly to homeschool them in nature, but truthfully to hide from a world that had labeled him a fraud. A sudden crash from outside snapped the moment like brittle glass. Mason was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Stay here," he ordered, moving to the window. Through sheets of rain, a massive shadow moved along the tree line. Taller than any man, broader at the shoulders than any bear, it seemed to glide between the pines with deliberate care. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, suddenly at his side despite instructions. Mason nodded, mouth dry. "Both of you, away from the windows, now." The night stretched endlessly, sleep coming in fitful snatches for all of them. They'd piled blankets in the main room, unwilling to separate into bedrooms. Sometime past midnight, the generator sputtered and died, leaving them in complete darkness save for the occasional lightning flash. "Dad," Ellie whispered after one such illumination, "I saw eyes watching us from the trees." Mason tightened his grip on the rifle across his lap. "I know. Are we in danger?" Her question carried the weight of scientific inquiry and childlike fear in equal measure. "I don't think so," he replied after careful consideration. "If it wanted to hurt us, it had plenty of opportunity before we returned." Morning arrived with reluctant grey light filtering through lingering storm clouds. Mason was the first outside, rifle ready but pointed downward. Fresh footprints circled the cabin, the same enormous distinctive tracks, now pressed deep into mud. The generator had been torn open, as if examined by curious hands. "It's intelligent," Mason murmured to himself, crouching beside a print. Methodical. When he stood, his gaze traveled to the tree line, where broken branches marked a path leading away from the cabin. Something moved in the shadows beyond, something that didn't belong in any scientific taxonomy he'd studied. For the first time in 5 years, the old familiar excitement of discovery stirred in Mason's chest, stronger than his fear. After a hurried breakfast, Mason stood on the porch, binoculars scanning the tree line. "Ellie, we need to check the perimeter. Jake, I need you to stay inside." "But Dad," Jake protested, "no arguments." "Lock the door behind us," Mason said, checking his pocket knife and slipping a first aid kit into his jacket. To Ellie he added quietly, "Bring your camera." Ellie nodded, retrieving the wildlife camera trap she'd been using for her independent biology project. As they stepped into the damp morning air, Mason noticed how his daughter moved with deliberate care, documenting each footprint with her camera before proceeding. "You really think it's still out there?" she asked, her skepticism fighting a losing battle with curiosity. "Something is," Mason replied, crouching beside a distinctive track. "See how these prints are different from last night's? The stride is shorter, the weight distribution changed. It's favoring its right side now. It's injured," Ellie concluded, snapping a photo. "More injured than before," Mason confirmed. "And look," he pointed to dark droplets on fallen leaves. "Blood trail." They followed the signs methodically, Mason falling into the tracking rhythm that had once been as natural as breathing. The trail led toward the old tool shed, 50 yards from the main cabin, a simple structure built against the hillside. "Wait here," Mason instructed when they were within sight of the shed. "Dad, if there's something dangerous, then one of us needs to stay back to get Jake." He didn't finish the thought. Inside the cabin, Jake watched through the window until his father and sister disappeared into the trees. The moment they were gone, he began his own investigation. Dad had always said he had his mother's curiosity, and Mom had been a researcher too. Jake methodically examined the areas of disturbance, the broken table, scattered books, overturned chairs. Near the fireplace, caught in the rough stone, he found it a tuft of coarse hair, reddish-brown and unlike anything he'd seen on local wildlife. By the time he heard footsteps on the porch, Jake had collected several samples in small bags from his science kit. Mason burst through the door, face pale. "Pack emergency supplies, we may need to leave." Ellie followed, her usual composure visibly shaken. Dad saw it. "What was it?" Jake demanded. "Samples forgotten." Mason ran a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know, not for certain." He moved to the fireplace, taking down the old box that contained Sarah's research journals. "But it's hurt, and it's hiding in our shed." The broken camera trap lay on the table, its memory card intact, but the casing cracked. Mason had set it at the shed entrance before approaching, triggered when the door swung open. The single captured image showed a blur of movement. Tall, broad, covered in matted fur. "It could still be a bear," Ellie suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "A bear doesn't stack firewood to make a bed," Mason countered. "A bear doesn't use a tarp as a bandage." Jake's eyes widened. "It's intelligent, more than that," Mason said quietly. "It knew I was there before I opened the door. It could have attacked, but it retreated instead. Made a sound almost like a warning." Ellie loaded the camera's image onto her laptop. Enhancing and sharpening revealed little, but what they could see defied easy explanation. An upright figure, proportions all wrong for a human, with a massive head and broad shoulders. "We have 3 options," Mason said, laying out medical supplies. "We leave now and hike to the road. We call for help on the emergency radio." Or, Jake prompted when his father trailed off. Mason's eyes met his children's. Or, "We try to help it." Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the distant rumble of lingering thunder. "It's dangerous," Ellie said finally. "So is leaving an intelligent, wounded creature to suffer," Mason replied. "And if it is what I think it might be." He stopped, decades of scientific caution warring with instinct. "Bigfoot," Jake whispered, excitement overtaking fear. "I was going to say an undocumented species," Mason corrected, though a flicker of his old passion showed through his careful words. "Your research," Ellie said suddenly, "before we moved here. That's what it was about, wasn't it? Not just unidentified wildlife signs, but them." Mason nodded slowly. "Your mother and I tracked reports for years. Found footprints, hair samples, heard vocalizations that matched no known species. When we published our findings, the scientific community laughed you out of academia," Ellie finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. "They called it career suicide," Mason acknowledged. "Maybe it was, but your mother never doubted what we'd found. And now one's in our backyard," Jake finished, bouncing on his toes. Mason gathered supplies into his pack with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to approach it again, with medicine this time. Food. A peace offering." "I'm coming too," Jake insisted. Mason shook his head. "Too dangerous. Both of you stay here, barricade the door if necessary." As he stepped onto the porch, medical supplies in hand, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The trembling excitement of standing on the edge of discovery. If he was right, everything would change. If he was wrong, he pushed the thought away and moved toward the shed, following the trail of blood drops glistening in the weak sunlight. The creature was gone when Mason reached the shed, but the signs of its presence remained. A depression in the stacked firewood, blood-stained rags torn from an old tarp, and most tellingly, the carefully closed door that no animal would have managed. A new trail led into the dense forest, marked by broken branches and occasional blood drops. Mason returned to the cabin, mind racing. "It's moved on," he told the children, spreading an old map across the kitchen table. The faded parchment showed the surrounding mountains in careful detail, with areas marked in faded ink and symbols Mason had spent years trying to decipher. Sarah had acquired it from a tribal elder during their research, one of the few who'd taken their work seriously. "This was your mother's most valued possession," Mason explained, fingers tracing the ancient markings. "She believed these symbols marked territories where the forest guardians were known to dwell." Ellie studied the map skeptically. "These could be anything, hunting grounds, water sources." "Maybe," Mason conceded. "But 4 of our most compelling evidence sites aligned with these markings. And look," he pointed to their location, then to a symbol half a mile away. "This is where the blood trail leads." Jake traced the route with his finger. "Can we follow it, please?" Mason hesitated, weighing the risks against the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. "We stay together, no exceptions, and we bring emergency supplies." The forest felt different as they hiked, watchful, as if the trees themselves tracked their movement. Mason led, following the increasingly faint trail with practiced eyes, occasionally consulting the ancient map. Ellie documented their journey in her journal, while Jake scanned the canopy with undisguised excitement. "There," Mason whispered suddenly, pointing to a disturbed area where something large had clearly bedded down. The ground was compressed, branches broken to form a crude shelter against a fallen log. "It stopped to rest," Ellie observed, touching dried blood on a leaf. Then continued. "And look at this," Jake called softly from nearby. He stood before a massive pine, pointing at its trunk. Carved into the bark was a series of symbols, straight lines intersected by curves in patterns that seemed deliberate, meaningful. Mason's breath caught. "Sarah documented similar markings in the Olympic Peninsula. What do they mean?" Jake asked, tracing them with his fingertips. "Your mother believed they were territorial markers," Mason replied. "Or perhaps warnings, or directions," Ellie suggested unexpectedly. "Look, they point toward that ridge, As if on cue, a sound echoed through the trees, not quite a howl, not quite a call, but something that raised the hair on Mason's neck with its almost human quality. The forest fell silent in its wake. We should head back, Mason decided reluctantly, noting how the afternoon shadows had lengthened. Storms picking up again. We can resume tomorrow. The return journey felt faster, more urgent. Twice, Mason paused, certain they were being watched. Once, Jake claimed to see movement among distant trees, a tall shadow, gone too quickly to identify. At the cabin, Mason secured the doors and windows as darkness fell and wind rattled the eaves. Over dinner, he shared stories he'd kept buried for years, expeditions with Sarah, evidence they'd collected, encounters with something that defied conventional taxonomy. "Why didn't you tell us before?" Ellie asked, her scientific skepticism softening as she connected these revelations to their current situation. Mason stared into his coffee cup. "It cost me everything professionally. Colleagues I'd respected for decades called me delusional. University funding dried up. Your mother was more resilient than I was. She wanted to continue despite the ridicule. But then her illness," he trailed off, the old grief surfacing briefly before he continued. "When she died, I couldn't face it anymore. The research, the academic battles, any of it. I brought you both here to start fresh, away from all that. But you kept Mom's map," Jake observed, "and her journals." Mason nodded. "I couldn't let go completely. Something in me knew she was right." The conversation continued into the evening, Mason answering their questions with a frankness that had been absent for years. It felt like the breaking of a dam, memories, theories, and suppressed excitement flowing freely after so long. Later, as the children slept, Mason stood on the porch, listening to the forest sounds returning after the storm's passage. Somewhere out there, a creature of legend was wounded, hiding, perhaps watching even now. "You were right, Sarah," he whispered to the night. "They're real, and tomorrow I'm going to prove it." As if in answer, a distant vocalization drifted through the trees, not aggressive, not fearful, but almost like an acknowledgement. Mason smiled into the darkness, feeling more alive than he had in years. Mason woke to Jake's urgent shaking. "Dad! Dad! It's back!" The pre-dawn light cast long shadows as Mason rushed to the window. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure, both familiar from his research and utterly alien in its reality. 7 feet tall at least, broad-shouldered and covered in matted reddish-brown fur. It stood upright but slightly hunched, one massive hand pressed against a pine trunk for support. "Ellie," Mason called softly, not taking his eyes from the creature. "Bring my field journal, the one with the red cover." She appeared beside him moments later, her scientific skepticism momentarily abandoned, as she stared at the impossible figure. "It's real," she whispered. Mason opened the journal with trembling fingers, turning to pages filled with detailed sketches, location data, and observation notes spanning decades. "Everything we documented, everything your mother believed," his voice caught. "This validates it all." The creature hadn't moved, its breath visible in the cool morning air. Even from this distance, Mason could see it was weakening, the way it leaned heavily against the tree, how its massive chest heaved with labored breathing. "It's getting worse," Jake observed, face pressed to the glass. "The wound must be infected," Mason agreed. "Without treatment." He didn't finish the thought, but determination settled over him like a familiar coat. Years of scientific training battled with instinctive caution as he gathered medical supplies. "What are you doing?" Ellie asked. "What your mother would have done," Mason replied simply. Outside, the morning air bit with autumn's chill as Mason slowly advanced across the clearing, hands visible, movements deliberate. The creature watched, dark eyes glinting with unmistakable intelligence beneath a heavy brow ridge. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mason said softly, knowing his words meant nothing but hoping his tone conveyed peaceful intent. "I want to help." 15 feet away, he stopped, setting the medical kit on the ground and backing away several steps. The creature's gaze shifted from Mason to the kit and back again. A low, rumbling sound emanated from its chest. Not quite a growl, something more complex, almost speech-like in its modulation. Mason held his breath as the creature took a hesitant step forward, then froze as headlights swept the clearing. A vehicle was approaching on the distant access road. The creature's reaction was immediate. It melted into the forest with surprising speed despite its injury, leaving Mason alone in the clearing as the vehicle drew closer. Back inside the cabin, Mason peered through binoculars. Forestry department truck, probably checking access roads after the storm. "Will they come here?" Jake asked, excitement and concern mingling in his voice. "Not likely," Mason replied. "We're well off their patrol route." But the interruption had broken the tentative connection, and the creature didn't return that morning. Instead, Mason gathered the family around the kitchen table. Sarah's research journals spread before them. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," he said, opening the worn field notes. "Your mother compiled the most comprehensive analysis of behavioral patterns ever documented. Page after page, detailed observations, theoretical migration routes, potential communication methods, and physiological estimations." Sarah's precise handwriting filled margins with questions, hypotheses, and connections to indigenous folklore. "Mom believed they were highly intelligent," Jake noted, reading a passage. "A complex social structure with generational knowledge transmission." Ellie studied a map marked with sighting clusters. "These follow natural corridors between wilderness areas, avoiding human development. They're not just animals," Mason said. Sarah theorized they possess language, tool usage, perhaps even cultural traditions passed through generations. As morning progressed to afternoon, the family immersed themselves in research long forgotten. Mason reconnecting with the work that had once defined him, the children discovering a legacy left by the mother they'd lost too young. Tonight, Mason decided finally, "We'll try again tonight." They're primarily nocturnal, more comfortable in darkness. As dusk approached, they prepared bandages, antiseptic, antibiotics from their emergency kit. Food offerings, simple, unprocessed items, Sarah's research suggested would be recognizable and safe. Jake set up a small battery-powered light near the back porch. Mum's notes said they're curious about artificial light, but frightened of fire. Ellie arranged the medical supplies with clinical precision. "If it has an infected wound, we need to clean it properly. The antibiotics might not be strong enough for something that size." "We'll do what we can," Mason replied. Night fell. They waited in silence, the cabin dark except for the single light outside. Hours passed with no sign of the creature. Then, just after midnight, a soft thud on the porch. "It's here," Jake whispered. Mason moved silently to the window. The creature stood hunched by the light, examining the offered supplies with evident curiosity. Its massive hand reached for a banana, peeling it with surprising dexterity. "It knows human food," Ellie observed quietly. "It's encountered people before." Slowly, carefully, Mason opened the door. The creature startled, dropping the fruit, but didn't flee. "It's okay," Mason said softly. "We want to help." For a breathless moment, man and legend regarded each other across the threshold. A moment Mason had spent a lifetime pursuing. The creature made that rumbling sound again, then pointed directly at its injured side. A gesture so deliberately communicative, it left no doubt about its intelligence. "I understand," Mason nodded. "You're hurt. I can help." Behind him, Jake and Ellie watched in wonder as decades of scientific pursuit culminated in this impossible encounter, the moment their parents' legacy stepped from myth into reality. The moment of connection was shattered by the sudden beam of headlights sweeping across the trees. The creature vanished into the darkness with surprising speed as the rumble of an approaching vehicle grew louder. "Someone's coming," Ellie whispered unnecessarily. Mason quickly gathered the medical supplies from the porch. "Both of you act normal. It's probably just someone who got turned around on the forest roads." The battered pickup truck came to a stop beside their cabin. its engine cutting off with a sputtering cough. A man emerged mid-40s, weathered face beneath a worn hunting cap, rifle slung casually over one shoulder. "Evening, folks," he called, approaching the porch. "Hope I'm not intruding. Got myself turned around in this weather. Saw your lights. Name's Garrett Reed." Mason stepped forward, offering a handshake that disguised his wariness. "Mason Harper. These are my children, Ellie and Jake. You're a fair way off the main roads." Reed smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Been tracking a prize buck for 3 days. Storm threw off my bearings." He glanced at the darkened forest. "Strange time of night to be out on your porch." "Generator trouble," Mason lied smoothly. "Was just checking if I could get it running again." Reed nodded, though his gaze lingered on the medical supplies visible in Mason's hand. "Mind if I warm up inside for a spell? Maps say the nearest road is still 10 miles out, and this weather's turning again." Mason hesitated only briefly. "Of course, can't leave anyone stranded in these mountains." Inside, Reed hung his jacket on a peg, revealing a laminated hunting license attached to his belt. He accepted the coffee Ellie offered with a grateful nod. "You folks live out here year-round, pretty isolated." "We prefer it that way," Mason replied, watching Reed survey the cabin with too keen interest. "Saw some mighty strange tracks on my way in," Reed remarked casually. "Too big for bear, wrong shape for moose." Jake's eyes widened before Ellie subtly nudged him. "Probably elk," Mason suggested. "They come through this valley sometimes." Reed smiled again, that same expression that never warmed his gaze. "Funny thing about tracks. I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years, and I've never seen elk tracks like those." He leaned forward. "You know what they reminded me of? Those footprint casts they sell at tourist traps, you know. Bigfoot souvenirs." An uncomfortable silence fell. Mason broke it with a forced chuckle. "Those things are ridiculous. No serious biologist gives them credence." "Biologist, huh?" Reed's interest sharpened. "That what you do, Mr. Harper? Former profession?" Mason answered carefully. "I teach my children now." Reed nodded thoughtfully. "Storm's getting worse. Any chance I could impose on your hospitality till morning? I've got my own gear in the truck." The request was reasonable, expected even, given the circumstances, but Mason felt unease crawling up his spine. Still, mountain hospitality had rules as old as the forests themselves. "Of course," he conceded. "You can take the couch in the main room." Later, after Reed had retrieved his pack and settled in, Mason gathered the children in the kitchen under the pretense of making more coffee. "I don't trust him," Ellie whispered. "The way he was asking about the tracks." "He knows something," Mason agreed. "But we can't turn him out in this weather. Just be careful what you say. No mention of our visitor." Jake nodded solemnly. "What about, will it come back with him here?" "I doubt it," Mason replied. "They're extremely cautious around strangers. Sarah's research suggested they can even detect differences in human scent, distinguish between individuals." When they returned to the main room, Reed was examining the old map still spread on the table. "Interesting markings," he commented. "Native old logging notations," Mason lied, casually folding the map away. "Nothing important." As the night wore on, Reed shared hunting stories that seemed calculated to elicit reactions, tales of unusual findings in remote areas, strange sounds in the wilderness, enormous shadowy figures glimpsed at dusk. "Had a buddy who swore he saw one once," Reed remarked, watching them carefully. "Said it was 7 feet tall at least, covered in reddish fur. Most folks laughed him out of town, but he stuck to his story till the day he died." "People see what they want to see in the wilderness," Mason replied, neutrally. "True enough," Reed agreed. "But sometimes, Mr. Harper, they see what's actually there, and no one believes them." He smiled. "Like scientists who risk their reputations, claiming evidence of creatures that can't possibly exist." The pointed comment hung in the air. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Somehow Reed knew, not just about the creature in their woods, but about Mason's past. "It's late," Mason said finally. "We should all get some rest." Later, as wind howled around the cabin eaves, Mason lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night. Reed's soft snoring came from the main room, but beneath it Mason caught another sound, the faint scrape of boot soles on wooden floor as their guest moved quietly around the darkened cabin. Dawn arrived with watery light filtering through lingering clouds. Mason found Reed already awake, heating coffee on the wood stove. On the table beside him lay several items, tufts of reddish-brown hair, a plaster cast of an enormous footprint, and yellowed newspaper clippings featuring a younger Mason and Sarah at a scientific conference. "Morning, Professor Harper," Reed said, emphasizing the title Mason hadn't used in years. Mason felt the children join him, Ellie's sharp intake of breath betraying her recognition of what lay on the table. "I believe we should talk honestly now," Reed continued, pushing the newspaper toward them. The headline read, "Respected biologists risk careers on Bigfoot research." "You've been in my things," Mason said quietly. Reed shrugged. "Necessary research. You're Mason Harper, former professor of evolutionary biology at Pacific Northwest University. You and your wife published 3 controversial papers on evidence of an undocumented bipedal primate species before the scientific community essentially exiled you." He tapped the article. "And now one's taken refuge near your cabin." Jake stepped forward. "You don't know anything." Reed smiled. "I know those tracks out there match these casts perfectly. I know the hair samples I found by your fireplace are identical to these." He held up one of the tufts. "And I know what I glimpsed watching your cabin last night wasn't a bear or elk." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove. "What do you want?" Mason finally asked. "Originally, a trophy like no hunters ever claimed," Reed admitted. "I've tracked stories of these creatures for 15 years, but now," he hesitated, "now I want the truth. Scientific validation. By shooting an undocumented species," Ellie challenged, her voice sharp with disapproval. Reed had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That was before I saw it. The intelligence in its eyes, the way it moves. It's not just an animal, is it?" "No," Mason confirmed quietly. "It's not." The admission hung in the air. Years of scientific caution abandoned in the face of Reed's evidence and their shared experience. "It's injured," Mason continued. "Gunshot wound, I believe. Infected." Reed nodded slowly. 3 days ago, about 10 miles northeast. I fired at movement, thought it was a bear. It howled." He shuddered at the memory, like nothing I've ever heard. "I tracked the blood trail until the storm hit. And it led you here," Mason finished. "Not directly," Reed corrected. "I lost the trail in the storm. Finding your cabin was coincidence. But when I saw those tracks," he spread his hands. "I've spent most of my adult life being called crazy for believing these creatures exist, just like you." Mason studied the man with new understanding. Not just a hunter, but another searcher, driven by the same need for confirmation that had defined his own career. "Dad," Ellie whispered, "can we trust him?" Before Mason could answer, Reed pulled a satellite phone from his pocket. "I've got partners waiting for my call. Specialists in cryptozoology with considerable financial backing. We could document this, protect it, share the discovery properly." His eyes gleamed. "Vindication for all of us who've been ridiculed." The offer hung temptingly in the air, scientific redemption, the chance to complete the work Sarah had believed in so deeply. "And if I refuse?" Mason asked carefully. Reed's expression hardened slightly. "The creature's injured on public land. I have as much right to track it as you do." The implied threat was clear. "Dad," Jake interjected, "remember what Mom always said about them. They've stayed hidden for centuries for a reason." The words struck Mason like a physical blow. Sarah had indeed theorized that these creatures deliberately avoided human contact, their survival dependent on remaining legendary rather than documented. "Jake's right," Mason said finally. "This isn't our discovery to make." Reed's expression darkened. "Don't be naive, Hop. If I found this creature, others will too. At least with proper documentation, it could be protected. Or hunted to extinction, Ellie countered. Once people know they exist, where they live, the creature chose to come here, Mason added. It sought us out specifically, perhaps recognizing we might help rather than harm it. That trust matters. Reed looked between them, frustration evident. So you'll do nothing? Waste the opportunity of a lifetime? I didn't say that, Mason replied. I intend to help it recover, then let it return to its kind without interference. Reed stood abruptly. I need to think. He stalked outside, satellite phone in hand. The moment he was gone, Ellie turned to her father. He's going to call his partners. I know, Mason replied grimly. What do we do? Jake asked, fear edging his voice. Mason gathered Sarah's journals, the map, and their own evidence. We need to move quickly. The creature is running out of time, and I suspect our guest isn't going to respect our decision. Through the window they watched Reed pacing near his truck, gesturing as he spoke into the satellite phone. His expression left little doubt about his intentions. He's not leaving without that creature, Mason said quietly. One way or another. While Reed continued his heated phone conversation outside, Mason quickly gathered essentials into 3 backpacks. We don't have much time, he whispered. Ellie, grab the first aid supplies. Jake, food and water. We need to find the creature before Reed's partners arrive. What about Reed? Ellie asked, methodically sorting medical supplies. Mason's expression hardened. I'll handle him. When Reed returned, his demeanor had changed, a forced casualness that didn't mask the triumph in his eyes. Had a good talk with my colleagues, he announced. They're very interested in our situation, scientific documentation only, of course. Mason nodded non-committally, watching Reed move to his truck. From the rear compartment, Reed retrieved a long case, bringing it inside despite Mason's visible discomfort. Just equipment, Reed explained, unlatching the case to reveal a sophisticated tranquilizer gun and several loaded darts. Humane capture technology. No permanent harm. Capture? Ellie questioned sharply. Reed's smile tightened. Figure of speech. For documentation purposes only. Mason's gaze fell to the markings on the gun case. Willard Institute for Biological Anomalies, a private collection infamous among serious researchers for its ethically questionable methods and exotic specimens acquired through legally dubious means. You work for Willard, Mason stated flatly. Reed's expression flickered. They fund my expeditions. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. They're not scientists, Mason countered. They're collectors. Trophy hunters with academic pretensions. Reed abandoned his friendly facade. They're offering resources you can't imagine, Harper. Full funding, state-of-the-art equipment, legal protection. The creature will be well treated. As a captive, Mason said. A living specimen for wealthy visitors to gawk at. Better than remaining a myth, Reed snapped. My team will be here by nightfall. Helicopters already en route to the nearest clearing. The children exchanged alarmed glances as the true stakes became clear. And if we refuse to help you find it? Mason asked quietly. Reed's hand moved casually to rest on the tranquilizer gun. That would be unfortunate. For everyone. The implied threat hung in the air as Reed checked his satellite phone again. Signals better up the ridge. I need to coordinate the extraction team's landing site. He moved toward the door, then paused. I admire your work, Harper. I really do. You should be part of this discovery. Don't force me to proceed without you. The door closed behind him. Through the window they watched him hike toward the ridge, satellite phone in hand. He's going to capture it, Jake said, voice trembling. No, he's not, Mason replied firmly, moving to the fireplace. He pulled a loose stone from the hearth, revealing a hidden compartment containing a key. Quickly now, the key unlocked a trapdoor beneath the kitchen rug, revealing a narrow stairway leading to a root cellar carved into the hillside. Mason grabbed a flashlight. You kids wait in here. There's an old mining tunnel that leads out to the creek bed. If anything happens, we're coming with you, Ellie interrupted. We're in this together. Mason hesitated, then nodded. Reed's partners won't arrive until evening. We have a few hours to find the creature and move it somewhere safe. Can we trust Reed's partners won't hurt it? Jake asked. Mason's expression darkened. Willard Institute doesn't acquire specimens for observation. They collect living trophies for private exhibition. If they capture it, he couldn't finish the sentence. Outside, they moved quietly away from the cabin, following the faint trail they'd tracked the previous day. Mason carried medical supplies and Sarah's journals, constantly scanning for any sign of Reed returning. There, Jake whispered suddenly, pointing to fresh tracks in the soft earth near the creek. The trail led uphill, toward a rocky outcropping, where ancient pines grew twisted from constant wind. As they climbed, Mason noticed something odd. The tracks occasionally disappeared on rocky ground, only to reappear exactly where the terrain would offer the best concealment. Not random animal movement, but deliberate evasion tactics. It knows it's being hunted, Mason murmured. Near the summit, Jake discovered another carved symbol on a massive pine, similar to those they'd found earlier, but freshly cut, the exposed wood still oozing sap. It's marking its path, Ellie observed. Maybe for others of its kind, or for us, Mason suggested quietly. The ridge offered a view across the valley, including their cabin and, more concerningly, Reed making his way back down from his call. They had little time left. As if responding to their urgency, a low vocalization echoed from a jumble of massive boulders ahead, not threatening, but clearly meant to attract attention. It's calling to us, Mason breathed. Decades of research crystallizing in this moment of communication. Cautiously, they approached the rocks. In the shadow of the largest boulder, partially concealed by fallen branches deliberately arranged for cover, the creature waited, watching them with eyes that held unmistakable intelligence, fear, and something Mason had never expected to recognize in a cryptid species: hope. The creature's breathing was labored, its massive chest rising and falling with evident effort. The wound on its side had festered, angry red flesh surrounding what was clearly a bullet hole. It needs antibiotics, Mason murmured, slowly approaching with hands visible. Ellie, the medical kit. The creature watched them, dark eyes intelligent and wary beneath a prominent brow ridge. It made no move to retreat, as Ellie carefully passed her father the supplies. I need to clean the wound, Mason explained, speaking as he would to any sentient being. It will hurt, but it will help. Whether it understood his words, or merely his tone, the creature extended its injured side slightly, a gesture of such trust it momentarily took Mason's breath away. Working carefully, he cleaned the infection while Ellie prepared an antibiotic injection. Jake stood nearby, sketching the creature with remarkable accuracy in a small notebook. The bullet's still inside, Mason observed grimly. I can feel it near the surface. The creature rumbled low in its chest as Mason probed the wound, but made no aggressive movement. Its eyes remained fixed on Mason's face, studying him with an intensity that felt almost familiar. We need to extract it, Ellie said, her scientific training overcoming her awe. The infection won't clear otherwise. Mason nodded, preparing a local anesthetic. This is going to sting, he warned. The creature flinched at the injection, but remained still. As they waited for the medicine to take effect, Jake moved closer, showing his drawing to the creature. To their astonishment, one massive finger reached out to touch the paper, then tapped a spot on the drawing where Jake had missed a detail of the fur pattern. It understands, Jake whispered, hurriedly correcting his sketch. Mason exchanged a look with Ellie. This wasn't just intelligence. This was a form of communication. The wound extraction went as well as could be expected in field conditions. The bullet removed, Mason cleaned and bandaged the area, while Ellie administered antibiotics and anti-inflammatory medication. We need to hide you, Mason told the creature once they'd finished. Bad men are coming who would take you away. A snapping twig behind them shattered the moment. They turned to find Reed standing at the edge of the clearing, tranquilizer gun ready. Step away from it, he ordered, voice cold and professional now, all pretense abandoned. Mason moved protectively in front of the creature. Reed, don't do this, My team's landing in 2 hours, Reed replied. That gives us just enough time to secure and transport it to the extraction point. His gaze hardened. I'm bringing this specimen in, Harper, with or without your cooperation. It's not a specimen, Ellie protested. It's intelligent, communicative. All the more valuable, Reed interrupted. Now move aside. The creature growled, a rumbling sound that vibrated the air between them. Reed's finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance, Harper. My partners have invested too much in this operation to walk away. Dad, Jake whispered urgently. The tunnel map. Mason's mind raced, remembering the old map of mining tunnels they'd discovered years ago while renovating the cabin. A forgotten network from the early logging days, including one entrance not far from where they stood. You're right about one thing, Reed, Mason said, slowly reaching into his pocket. It's time to make a choice. He pulled out not a weapon but an ancient folded paper. This shows a way out, a tunnel system under the mountain. We can all leave this clearing alive if you just walk away now. Reed's laugh was brittle. You think I'd fall for that? The creature comes with me. You three can go home once we're done. Reed, Mason began, but was interrupted by a distant mechanical throbbing. Reed smiled. Sounds like my team's ahead of schedule. The distraction was all they needed. The creature moved with surprising speed for its size, disappearing into the forest before Reed could react. Mason grabbed his children's hands and bolted in the opposite direction. Run, he shouted, as Reed fired the tranquilizer dart into the space where they had been standing. They sprinted downhill, Mason leading them not toward the cabin, but to the creek bed where the old mining tunnel emerged. Behind them, Reed crashed through the underbrush, cursing. There, Mason pointed to a dark opening partly concealed by fallen logs, exactly where the tunnel map had indicated. Inside, cool darkness enveloped them. Mason switched on his flashlight, revealing a narrow passage shored up with ancient timbers. This leads under the ridge and comes out near the North Creek, he explained breathlessly. We can circle back to the cabin through the ravine. They moved as quickly as they dared, the sounds of Reed's pursuit fading behind them. The tunnel sloped gently downward, the air growing damper. Will the creature be okay? Jake asked, his voice echoing slightly. It knows these woods better than any of us, Mason replied, hoping it was true. A deep rumble shook the tunnel, dust and small stones raining down from above. That's not the helicopter, Ellie said, alarm edging her voice. Before Mason could respond, a more violent tremor shook the passage. Ancient supports groaned, wood cracking like gunshots in the confined space. Run, Mason shouted, pushing the children ahead as a section of ceiling collapsed behind them. The tunnel filled with choking dust as they stumbled forward. Another crack, and Mason felt the ground shift beneath him. Dad, Jake screamed as the floor gave way between them, opening a dark chasm that separated Mason from his children. Keep going, Mason shouted across the widening gap. Follow the tunnel to the exit. I'll go back and find another way. We're not leaving you, Ellie cried. You have to. Get to the cabin. Use the radio to call for help. The gap was too wide to jump now. I'll meet you there. The last thing Mason saw before the dust enveloped everything was his children's terrified faces as Ellie pulled her brother forward into the darkness. Alone now, Mason turned back the way they had come, heart pounding with fear not for himself but for them, and for the wounded creature still somewhere in these woods, with Reed and his team closing in. Mason backtracked through the tunnel, dust filling his lungs with each labored breath. The flashlight beam caught glimmers of mica in the rock walls, momentarily beautiful despite his dire circumstances. The tunnel forked unexpectedly, presenting a choice Mason hadn't anticipated. The map in his pocket had shown only a single passage. A deep vocalization echoed through the darkness, distinct from the settling rocks. Mason froze, listening. It came again, the same rumbling call they'd heard in the forest, but closer, almost directly above. Following instinct rather than logic, Mason chose the upward-sloping passage. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to crouch as he advanced. Ahead, a faint glow indicated an opening, not sunlight, but a diffuse illumination Mason couldn't identify. He emerged into a small cavern, where light filtered through a crack in the ceiling. Standing in the center, massive and unmistakable, was the creature, its dark eyes finding Mason immediately. "You followed me," Mason said, surprise evident in his voice. The creature made that rumbling sound again, then gestured toward the tunnel behind Mason, clearly inquiring about the children. "They're heading to safety," Mason explained, marveling at the implicit communication. "But Reed is still out there. We need to move." The creature cocked its head, then approached a wall of the cavern. In the dim light, Mason saw ancient markings etched into the stone, symbols similar to those on the trees, but weathered by centuries. The creature touched one particular symbol reverently, then looked at Mason with clear expectation. "I don't understand," Mason admitted. The creature rumbled impatiently, then took Mason's hand in its massive palm. A gesture so unexpected it momentarily stole Mason's breath. The skin felt leathery yet warm, the grip gentle despite its obvious strength. It guided Mason's fingers to the stone marker, tracing the symbol. As Mason's fingers followed the ancient grooves, recognition dawned. This matched markings on Sarah's map, symbols she'd puzzled over for years. "A boundary marker," Mason whispered. "You're showing me your territory." The creature released his hand and moved toward another tunnel entrance, clearly indicating Mason should follow. With Reed still searching above and the children making their way to the cabin, Mason had little choice. They traveled in silence through passages that grew increasingly smooth, less like natural formations and more like constructed pathways. Occasionally the creature would stop at another marker, allowing Mason to study the symbols. Each matched notations on Sarah's map, confirming theories she'd developed but never lived to prove. "She was right about everything," Mason murmured, grief and vindication mingling in his chest. The creature paused, watching him with those intelligent eyes. It gestured to the medical pack still slung over Mason's shoulder, then to its bandaged wound. "Does it hurt?" Mason asked. "I can give you more medicine." Working by flashlight, Mason checked the wound, relieved to find no fresh bleeding. He administered another dose of antibiotics, his scientific mind noting the creature's apparent comfort with the needle, as if it had experienced human medical care before. "You've encountered people before us," Mason realized aloud. "People who helped you." The creature made no sound, but its gaze seemed to confirm Mason's suspicion. Perhaps there had been others over the decades, isolated encounters with humans who kept the secret, contributing to legends while protecting the truth. As Mason repacked the supplies, his flashlight beam caught something embedded in the cavern floor, something distinctly out of place. Kneeling, he brushed away centuries of dust to reveal carved figures in the stone, crude representations of tall, hairy beings standing alongside human forms, hands joined in what could only be interpreted as cooperation. "Your kind and mine," Mason breathed. "We knew each other once." The creature watched him intently, then made a sound unlike its previous vocalizations, almost speech-like in its complexity. "I wish I understood you," Mason said. "There's so much we could learn from each other." Ellie and Jake emerged from the tunnel into the sharp brightness of afternoon, blinking as their eyes adjusted after the underground darkness. The creek gurgled nearby, swollen from recent storms. "Dad will be okay, right?" Jake asked, voice small against the vastness of the forest. Ellie squeezed her brother's shoulder, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. "He knows these mountains better than anyone. We need to focus on getting back to the cabin." Jake nodded, pulling his compass from his pocket, the last birthday gift from their mother before she died. The small brass instrument gleamed in the sunlight, its needle swinging decisively north. "Cabin southwest," he said, orienting himself with practiced ease. Despite being only 12, Jake had inherited their mother's natural sense of direction. They set off through underbrush still wet from yesterday's storm, moving as quietly as their urgency allowed. The distant drone of a helicopter pulsed through the air, growing steadily louder. "They're searching the valley," Ellie observed, pulling Jake into the shelter of a massive pine as the aircraft passed overhead. "We need to stay under the canopy." Jake clutched the compass tightly, its weight a comforting connection to their mother. Sarah had insisted both children learn navigation skills from an early age. "Nature doesn't care how good your GPS is when the battery dies," she'd often said. "Ellie," Jake whispered suddenly, "do you think Mom knew? About the creatures, I mean. Really knew, not just theorized?" The question hung between them as they navigated a steep ravine, helping each other over slick rocks. "I think," Ellie began, choosing her words carefully, "I think Mom understood more than anyone gave her credit for. Remember how she used to tell us to listen to the forest? That it had its own language if we learned to hear it?" Jake nodded. "She wasn't just talking about bird calls and wind patterns, was she?" "Maybe not," Ellie admitted, her scientific skepticism softening in the face of everything they'd witnessed. "Maybe she was preparing us for this, in her way." The terrain grew more challenging as afternoon shadows lengthened. They were forced to detour around a section of forest where recent storms had toppled several large trees, creating an impassable tangle of roots and branches. "We're losing time," Ellie said, checking the position of the sun. "And the helicopter's making another sweep." Jake paused, head tilted, as he listened to something beyond the helicopter's drone. "Do you hear that?" Ellie froze, straining to catch what had alerted her brother. There, a subtle cracking of branches, too rhythmic for wind. "Too heavy for deer. Someone's following us," she whispered. They pressed onward with renewed urgency, the compass guiding their path through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. The detour had taken them further from known landmarks, into a section of forest denser and darker than the areas they usually explored. "We should have reached Miller's Creek by now," Jake said. Frowning at the compass, Ellie studied their surroundings, unease growing. "Unless we're further east than we thought. The tunnel exit might not have been where Dad expected." The realization was sobering. They could be miles from where they believed. Their carefully plotted route useless, as if sensing their uncertainty. The forest fell unnaturally silent around them. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, only the distant helicopter and their own careful footsteps. "Something's watching us," Jake whispered, unconsciously moving closer to his sister. Ellie felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes tracking their movement. Not threatening, but intensely aware. She recalled their father's stories of being studied by wildlife during his research expeditions. "It's okay," she said softly, though whether to reassure Jake or whatever watched them, she wasn't sure. The silence broke with a low, rumbling call from the ridge above, similar to what they'd heard from the wounded creature, but deeper, more resonant. "There's another one," Jake whispered, excitement overshadowing fear. Before Ellie could respond, movement caught her eye, a flash of russet fur between distant trees, larger than a bear, moving with deliberate purpose. "It's circling ahead of us," she realized. "Guiding us or herding us," Jake suggested, his wilderness knowledge sometimes exceeding his sister's despite her scientific training. They pushed forward cautiously, compass temporarily forgotten, as they followed the intermittent glimpses of their unseen guide. The terrain began to look vaguely familiar, rock formations Ellie recognized from previous hikes with their father. "I think we're back on course," she said, relief evident in her voice. They emerged suddenly into a small clearing containing a dilapidated structure, an old ranger station, abandoned for decades, but still standing against the elements. "We can shelter here," Ellie decided, noting the rapidly darkening sky. "Get our bearings before continuing." Inside, dust covered every surface, but the roof remained sound. Jake found an old kerosene lamp that still contained fuel, providing warm light as dusk gathered outside. "Look at this," he called from a small back room. Someone was monitoring them. Ellie joined him, finding a desk covered with faded reports and topographical maps marked with symbols eerily similar to those they'd seen carved into trees. "These are official Forest Service documents," she said, examining yellowed papers. "Sighting reports, footprint measurements, hair samples, all filed away and forgotten." Jake opened a drawer, finding a journal filled with meticulous observations. This ranger was tracking them systematically for years, and then stopped, Ellie noted, checking the final entry date. Or was stopped. Outside, the forest had gone completely silent again. The helicopter sounds had faded, but Ellie knew Reed's team was still searching, still a threat to the creatures who seemed to be everywhere around them. Unseen but undeniably present. "We'd need to reach Dad," she said, gathering the most relevant documents. These could help protect them. As they prepared to leave the shelter, Jake paused at the window, compass clutched tightly in his hand. "Ellie," he whispered, "I think we need to rethink our plan." Surrounding the cabin in the gathering darkness stood three massive silhouettes, larger than humans, covered in fur visible even in the dim light, watching the shelter with unmistakable intelligence. "They've been tracking us all along," Ellie breathed, scientific amazement replacing fear as she realized the implications. "We're not lost at all. They've been guiding us somewhere specific. The question was where and why." Mason emerged from the tunnel system at a different opening than he'd entered, finding himself disoriented until he spotted the distinctive twin peaks that marked the northern boundary of their property. The helicopter sound had grown fainter, moving toward the eastern valley. A crack of breaking branches pulled his attention to the forest edge where Reed stood, tranquilizer gun raised. "Where is it, Harper?" Reed demanded, all pretense of civility abandoned. "Gone," Mason replied honestly. "Back to wherever it came from." Reed's face contorted with frustration. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The opportunity you've thrown away? My partners have invested millions in this expedition. It's not a specimen to be collected," Mason countered, slowly moving away from the tunnel entrance to draw Reed's attention from it. "It's an intelligent species that deserves protection, not captivity." "Protection?" Reed scoffed. "From whom?" "The logging companies. The resort developers. The world's closing in on their habitat, Harper. Willard Institute could provide sanctuary. A cage is still a cage, no matter how gilded." Reed's expression hardened. "Where are your children?" The question sent ice through Mason's veins. "Why?" "Insurance," Reed replied coldly, pulling out his phone and showing Mason a series of photos. Caged exotic creatures, some clearly endangered, others Mason couldn't even identify. "Willard's collection. Specimens most researchers believe are extinct or mythical. You're threatening my children?" Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm offering perspective," Reed corrected. "This creature is coming with me one way or another. The only question is whether your family benefits from the arrangement or becomes collateral damage." A low rumble emanated from the forest behind Reed, causing him to spin around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the wounded creature, watching them with those intelligent eyes. "Perfect timing," Reed murmured, raising the tranquilizer gun. "No!" Mason lunged forward, but Reed was too quick, sidestepping his attack. "Stay back," Reed warned, aiming at the creature. "This dart contains enough sedative to drop an elephant. At this range, I won't miss." The creature made no move to flee, its gaze shifting between Mason and Reed, with clear understanding of the situation. "Please," Mason addressed the creature directly. "Run! He'll capture you." Instead of retreating, the creature took a deliberate step forward, then another, moving with surprising grace despite its injury. "Last chance, Harper," Reed said, finger tightening on the trigger. "Call it off or I shoot." "It's not a pet to be commanded," Mason replied, watching in amazement as the creature continued its steady approach. "It's making its own choice," Reed fired. With shocking speed, Mason threw himself forward, feeling the dart's sting as it embedded in his shoulder instead of the creature. The world immediately began to blur, the powerful sedative racing through his system. Through dimming vision, Mason saw the creature rush forward as he collapsed, felt massive arms catch him before he hit the ground. "Remarkable!" Reed's voice seemed to come from far away. "Protective instinct extended to humans. My partners will be fascinated." Mason struggled to remain conscious as the creature gently lowered him to the forest floor. Through the gathering darkness of the drug, he saw Reed preparing another dart. "You've only delayed the inevitable," Reed told the creature, as if it could understand. Perhaps it could. The sedative pulled Mason deeper into darkness, but not before he saw Ellie and Jake burst into the clearing, their arrival drawing Reed's attention away from the creature. "Dad!" Jake's voice seemed to echo from a great distance. "Stay back!" Reed ordered, swinging the gun toward the children. The creature reacted instantly, moving with impossible speed for something so large. It knocked the weapon from Reed's hands with one powerful swipe, then stood protectively over Mason's semi-conscious form. Reed stumbled backward, shock replacing confidence. "That's impossible. No animal would—" "It's not just an animal," Ellie's voice cut through Mason's fading awareness. "And it's not alone." The last thing Mason registered before the sedative claimed him completely was Reed's expression of dawning terror as dark shapes emerged from the forest around them. 3, 4, 5 massive creatures moving with silent, coordinated purpose. Darkness took him then, the tranquilizer too powerful to resist further. His last conscious thought was not fear for himself or even his children, but a profound sense of vindication. Sarah had been right all along. They existed. They were intelligent. And now, finally, the world would have to acknowledge the truth they'd sacrificed everything to prove. Mason drifted in chemical sleep, unaware of the confrontation unfolding around his motionless form, or of the helicopter landing in the distant clearing, disgorging men with cages and capture equipment. Unaware, too, of his children's desperate stand alongside creatures of legend to protect not just their father, but a secret that had survived for centuries at the boundary between myth and reality. Ellie stood protectively in front of her unconscious father, Jake beside her as Reed backed away from the advancing creatures. The wounded one they'd treated remained closest, almost guarding Mason's still form. "My team's landing now," Reed warned, pulling out a small radio transmitter from his jacket. "They're armed with more than tranquilizers." "Call them off," Ellie demanded. "You've seen how intelligent these beings are. This isn't just a scientific discovery. It's first contact with another sentient species." Reed's gaze darted between the surrounding creatures and the children. "You're just like your parents, romanticizing what should be studied objectively. These are biological specimens, not people." The radio crackled. "Reed, we've landed. What's your position?" Before he could respond, the largest of the creatures, nearly 8 feet tall with silver-streaked fur, stepped forward with frightening speed and snatched the radio from Reed's hand, crushing it effortlessly. "They understand technology," Jake whispered. "Or overcoming fear." Reed's confident facade cracked. "My team will find us regardless. You can't stop this." The wounded creature made a series of complex vocalizations to the others. Though unintelligible to human ears, the communication was clearly coordinated, purposeful. 2 of the creatures moved to Mason, gently lifting his unconscious form. "What are they doing?" Ellie asked, alarmed. "Taking him somewhere safe," Jake realized. "Away from Reed's team." The silver-backed creature gestured toward a dense section of forest with unmistakable intent. "The children should follow." "We need to go with them," Jake insisted. Pulling at Ellie's sleeve, Reed lunged suddenly, grabbing Jake's arm. "You're not going anywhere. You're my insurance now." The response was immediate and terrifying. Every creature tensed, fur bristling, powerful muscles coiling beneath their massive frames. The silverback bared impressive canines in a display that made Reed freeze in primal fear. "Let him go," Ellie said quietly. "Or they'll tear you apart." Reed hesitated, then released Jake, who quickly retreated behind his sister. "You can't hide forever," Reed warned, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. "There are 6 men with tracking equipment heading this way. Then you better hope they find you before these creatures decide you're a threat," Ellie replied coldly. Backing away toward the waiting group, they followed the creatures deeper into the forest, 2 carrying their father with surprising gentleness, while the wounded one led the way and others guarded their flanks. Despite their size, they moved through the dense undergrowth with practiced silence. Behind them, Reed's shouts for his team echoed through the trees, growing fainter as distance and forest density muffled the sound. "Where are they taking us?" Ellie whispered to Jake. "Somewhere safe," he replied with unexpected certainty. Mom's research journals mentioned cave systems throughout these mountains, places that might have sheltered them for generations. The wounded creature occasionally glanced back, ensuring the children kept pace. Despite its injury, it moved with determined purpose, following a route invisible to human eyes but clearly established by long use. After nearly an hour of steady travel, they arrived at the base of a sheer cliff face, invisible from below until they were nearly upon it. A narrow opening, disguised by strategically placed vegetation, revealed a passage into darkness. The creature carrying Mason ducked inside, followed by the others. Jake entered without hesitation, but Ellie paused at the threshold. Scientific caution briefly overriding curiosity. "We'll be trapped if Reed's team finds this entrance," she warned. The wounded creature rumbled softly, then deliberately moved aside a section of rock wall, revealing ancient handholds carved into the stone, an escape route invisible unless shown. "They've planned for everything," Jake whispered, or evident in his voice. Inside, the passage widened into a series of connected chambers, dimly illuminated by narrow fissures in the ceiling that admitted slanted sunlight. The air was surprisingly fresh, suggesting a complex ventilation system through the mountain. Mason lay on a bed of gathered pine boughs, still unconscious, but breathing evenly. The dart had been removed from his shoulder, the small wound carefully cleaned. "How long will he be out?" Jake asked, kneeling beside their father. "Hours, based on what Reed said about the sedative strength," Ellie answered, checking Mason's pulse. "We need to keep him warm." The silverback creature watched them tend to their father, then made a deliberate gesture, hands pressed together near its chest, then extended toward the children. The meaning seemed unmistakable. "Gratitude. They're thanking us," Jake said softly, "for helping the wounded one." The creatures moved with purpose around the cavern, some keeping watch near the entrance, while others prepared what appeared to be medicinal herbs, crushing them between smooth stones. One approached with a handful of the crushed mixture, offering it to Ellie while pointing at Mason's shoulder. "I think it's medicine," she said, cautiously accepting the paste. "For the dart wound." As she applied it, the radio captured from Reed crackled to life from where it had been placed in the corner of the cavern. "All units converge on Sector 7. Heat signatures detected in the northeast quadrant. Deploy perimeter sensors and prepare containment equipment." The creatures tensed, exchanging what could only be described as concerned glances. "Reed's team is hunting them systematically," Ellie realized, the enormity of the situation becoming clear. This isn't just about capturing one injured individual. They're trying to find their entire community. The wounded creature approached, gesturing deeper into the cave system, then making a sweeping motion that encompassed itself and the others. "There are more of them further in," Jake interpreted. "A whole family group, maybe dozens." The silverback made a decisive sound, and several creatures moved toward the exit, clearly preparing to defend their territory. "Wait!" Ellie called, an idea forming. "We need a better plan than direct confrontation. They have technology, tranquilizers, probably tracking equipment." The silverback paused, studying her with ancient eyes that seemed to evaluate not just her words, but her intentions. "We need to help them," Jake said firmly. "Just like Mom and Dad would have done." Ellie nodded, determination replacing fear. "We need to protect their secret. It's what Dad was trying to do all along." Outside, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed against the mountainside, growing louder by the moment as Reed's team closed in on their hiding place. The wounded creature led Ellie and Jake deeper into the cave system, away from the main entrance, where several of its kind stood guard. They moved through a series of increasingly complex passages, some natural, others clearly modified by deliberate hands. "Look," Jake whispered, pointing to the cave walls. In the beam of Ellie's flashlight, ancient paintings emerged from the darkness, crude but unmistakable depictions of tall, hairy beings alongside human figures. Some scenes showed joint hunting parties. Others portrayed what appeared to be knowledge exchanges, humans offering tools, the creatures providing something in return that looked like plants or herbs. They've coexisted with humans before, Ellie breathed. Her scientific mind racing to process the implications, the creature rumbled softly, watching their reactions with evident intelligence. It gestured to one particular scene, a circular arrangement where both species sat together around what might have been fire. They want us to understand something about their history with humans, Jake suggested. The passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber where a dozen more creatures of varying sizes gathered. Some tended small children, others prepared what appeared to be food or medicine from gathered plants. All activity ceased when the humans entered, every eye turning to study the newcomers. A very old creature with white streaked fur approached slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age. It examined the children without fear, then made a series of complex vocalizations to the wounded one. "I think that's their elder," Jake whispered. "Maybe their leader." The wounded creature responded with its own sounds, occasionally gesturing toward the children and the passage leading back to their father. The elder listened, then did something extraordinary. It extended a gnarled hand in what could only be interpreted as a greeting. Ellie hesitated only briefly before accepting the gesture, her small hand engulfed by the creature's massive palm. "We want to help you," she said, knowing her words meant nothing but hoping her intent was clear. The elder released her hand and moved to a depression in the cave floor, where dozens of smooth stones had been arranged in patterns. With deliberate movements, it rearranged several stones into a new configuration, a crude map, Ellie realized, showing the mountain and surrounding valleys, using a blackened stick as a pointer. The elder indicated several locations around the mountain, then made a sweeping gesture outward, followed by a crushing motion with its massive hands. "They're surrounded," Jake interpreted. "Reed's team is closing in from all sides." The wounded creature approached, carrying something unexpected, one of Mason's field journals, recovered from his pack. It opened the book to a page containing Sarah's detailed drawings of the mountain cave systems, some of which coincided with their current location. Mom mapped these caves, Ellie realized. She knew about them. The elder made another series of vocalizations, and two younger creatures brought forward a collection of items: metal fragments, tattered cloth, rusted equipment parts, human artifacts spanning what appeared to be decades, perhaps centuries. "They've been collecting evidence of human intrusion," Jake said. "Monitoring us as we monitor them," the wounded creature selected one item specifically, a broken camera identical to the modern trail cameras. Mason sometimes used for wildlife research. "They understand we document them," Ellie said. "They know about our technology." The elder returned to the stone map, placing small, dark rocks at points corresponding to Reed's team's locations. Then, using lighter stones, it created a pattern showing movement through the caves and mountainside, an escape strategy. "They're planning to evacuate," Ellie concluded. "To abandon this territory," Jake shook his head. "This is their home. They shouldn't have to leave because of Reed." The wounded creature watched this exchange carefully, then approached a wall, where yet more cave paintings depicted an ancient confrontation. Creatures and humans standing together against a third group represented by sharp, angular figures. "They faced threats alongside humans before," Ellie said, understanding dawning. "They're not showing us an escape plan. They're proposing an alliance." As if confirming her interpretation, the elder placed two stones, one dark, one light, side by side at a strategic point on the stone map. Jake's eyes widened. "They want to work with us to drive Reed away?" The wounded creature made a sound almost like affirmation, then led them to another section of the cave where a startling sight greeted them. Mason's field equipment, carefully arranged alongside strange tools of stone and bone. Their father's scientific instruments had been studied, replicated in primitive materials with surprising accuracy. "They've been learning from us," Ellie whispered. "Just as Mom and Dad were learning from them." The elder approached again, this time carrying something that made both children catch their breath, a small, carved wooden figurine of a woman with flowing hair. unmistakably meant to represent their mother. "They knew, Mom," Jake said, voice breaking slightly. The elder placed the figurine in Ellie's hands with gentle reverence, then made a gesture encompassing the entire cave system and all its inhabitants. The meaning seemed clear. Sarah had been trusted. Now that trust extended to her children. A commotion from the tunnel entrance interrupted the moment. One of the guard creatures returned with urgent vocalizations. The elder responded immediately, the entire group moving with coordinated purpose. "Reed's team must be getting closer," Ellie said, pocketing the wooden figurine for safekeeping. The wounded creature gestured for them to follow, as the community mobilized with impressive efficiency. Young were gathered, essential supplies collected, strategic positions assigned through a communication system the children could sense but not comprehend. Back in the main chamber, they found Mason beginning to stir, the powerful sedative finally wearing off. The elder examined him briefly, then made a decision, gesturing to several younger creatures who moved towards specific tunnel entrances. "I think we're about to see why these beings have remained undiscovered for centuries," Jake said, watching the coordinated defensive preparations with growing admiration. Outside, the helicopter circled lower, its searchlights sweeping the mountainside, as Reed's team closed in on the secret that had survived at the boundary between myth and scientific discovery, a secret now defended by an unlikely alliance of humans and legends come to life. Mason awoke to his children's worried faces hovering above him, the sedative's fog slowly lifting from his mind. Beyond them, massive figures moved purposefully through the dimly lit cavern. "What happened?" he mumbled, struggling to sit up. "Where are we?" "They're home," Jake answered simply. "And Reed's team is closing in." As awareness returned fully, Mason took in their surroundings with professional assessment. The strategic cave layout, the organized activity, the clear signs of long-term habitation. Everything Sarah had theorized, laid out before him in living detail. "She was right about everything," he whispered. "They knew, Mom," Ellie said, showing him the carved figurine. "They trusted her. Now they're asking for our help." One of the younger creatures approached, offering Mason water in a crude but effective stone cup. He accepted with a nod of thanks, noting the careful way the being observed his reaction, studying him as intently as he studied them. "Reed has at least 6 men with tracking equipment," Mason said, memories of the confrontation returning. Professional hunters. The wounded creature they'd treated appeared from a side passage, carrying something that stopped Mason's breath, an intricately constructed system of primitive traps and alarms fashioned from forest materials. The craftsmanship showed remarkable ingenuity, trip lines of woven plant fiber, warning devices using hollow wood that would resonate when disturbed, and simple but effective snares. They've been protecting themselves for generations, Mason realized. Examining the mechanisms with professional appreciation, the elder creature entered, making a series of vocalizations that sent the younger ones hurrying to different tasks. It approached Mason with dignified purpose, studying him with eyes that carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "They have a plan," Jake explained. "They want us to help create diversions while they relocate the young and vulnerable deeper into the mountain." Mason nodded, understanding flowing between species without language. "We know these mountains. We can lead Reed's team away from their retreat path." The elder made a sound of apparent approval, then gestured to the wounded creature, who spread what appeared to be a map made of pressed tree bark on the ground. Marked in natural dyes were locations corresponding to what Mason recognized as particularly challenging terrain: dangerous ravines, unstable rock slides, treacherous bogs. "They know every hazard on this mountain," Mason observed. "Natural defenses they've likely used before." Ellie pointed to several marked locations. "I think these are the traps they've prepared over time. Look, they correspond to the main approach routes to this cave system." The elder confirmed with a rumbling vocalization, then added another mark near the valley floor: "The helicopter landing site." "That's our primary target," Mason decided. "Without air support, Reed's team is just 6 men in unfamiliar territory. The plan came together with surprising efficiency. The creatures would evacuate their young along hidden routes while setting diversions at strategic points. Mason and the children would use their knowledge of human technology to disable the helicopter if possible, or at minimum lead the search team along false trails away from the evacuation route. Jake was assigned to work with several younger creatures, his small size an advantage for setting up the forest alarm systems. Simple but effective devices that would create sounds mimicking the creature's calls from multiple locations simultaneously, confusing the hunter's sense of direction. Eerily, with her scientific knowledge, would create convincing decoy evidence, hair samples and tracks at misleading locations, using materials the creatures provided from their own collections. Mason would take the most dangerous role, direct contact with Reed, offering a false cooperation that would lead the hunting party into prepared dead ends while the community escaped. As they prepared to move out, the wounded creature approached Mason privately. It made a series of gestures toward its healing injury, then to Mason, followed by a movement that encompassed the entire cave and its inhabitants. The meaning seemed clear, a debt acknowledged, a bond formed. "We protect each other now," Mason replied simply. The creature held his gaze with profound intelligence, then did something unexpected. It extended its hand in the human gesture of agreement. Mason clasped the massive palm, feeling rough calluses and surprising warmth against his skin. Outside the cave, dusk gathered as they moved into position. The helicopter had landed in a clearing a half-mile away, its crew setting up sophisticated tracking equipment. Through binoculars, Mason observed Reed directing operations with military precision. "They're establishing a perimeter," he told Ellie and Jake as they crouched in the underbrush. "Thermal imaging equipment, motion sensors, tranquilizer rifles with night scopes. Will our plan work against all that?" Ellie asked. Mason smiled grimly. "Technology has weaknesses. It can be fooled, overloaded, misdirected. And they're counting on tracking animals. Not intelligent beings with centuries of experience avoiding detection." The forest around them seemed to come alive as darkness fell completely. Subtle movements as creatures took positions, quiet sounds of prepared traps being activated. The sense of coordinated purpose flowing through the wilderness. "Remember what your mother always said," Mason told his children softly. "The forest itself is their greatest ally. They don't just live here, they're part of it in ways we're only beginning to understand." In the clearing below, Reed's voice carried on the night air as he addressed his team. "Remember, we want the specimens alive and undamaged. $50 million for intact captures, nothing for casualties. Priority on juveniles and the wounded adult." Mason felt a surge of protective anger at the callous commodification of these remarkable beings. "Let's show them why some legends should remain undisturbed," he said, signaling the beginning of their counter-offensive. Across the mountainside, the first diversionary calls echoed through the darkness, perfect mimicry of creature vocalizations from multiple directions simultaneously. Below, Reed's team reacted immediately, splitting up to investigate the contradictory sound sources. The ancient contest between hunter and hunted had begun again. But this time, the hunted had human allies who understood the hunter's methods. And as Jake triggered the first of many prepared surprises, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, doing precisely what he was meant to do. Reed paced the command perimeter, frustration evident in every line of his body. For 3 hours, his team had chased shadows through the darkened forest, responding to calls that led nowhere, tracking heat signatures that vanished inexplicably, following footprints that ended at solid rock faces. "This is coordinated resistance," he snapped into his satellite phone. "They're more intelligent than we anticipated." Mason watched from the shadows, counting Reed's remaining men. 2 hadn't returned from their latest expedition into the western ravine, where Jake and his creature allies had prepared particularly convincing diversions. "It's working," Mason whispered to Ellie, who crouched beside him at the forest edge. "They're exhausted and confused," Ellie nodded, checking her watch. "The evacuation should be nearly complete. The elder and the young ones were heading for the high caves when I left Jake at the North Passage. Reed's satellite phone rang, drawing their attention back to the clearing. His expression shifted from frustration to shock as he listened. "What do you mean, cancel the operation?" he demanded. "We're close to—" He fell silent, listening intently. "Sir, with all due respect, we've invested too much to—" Another pause. "Yes, sir, understood." He lowered the phone slowly, staring at it as if it had betrayed him. "Something's changed," Ellie whispered. Mason nodded, shifting position for a better view. One of Reed's men approached, asking a question Mason couldn't hear. "Mission parameters have changed," Reed responded, loud enough to carry to their hiding place. "We're being ordered to stand down after all this." The man protested. "We've got thermal imaging showing at least a dozen large specimens in these woods." Reed's expression hardened. "Orders are orders. Pack up the non-essentials. We'll make one final sweep of the eastern slope at dawn, then extract." Mason and Ellie exchanged puzzled glances. This unexpected development wasn't part of their plan. "I'm going to try something," Mason decided. "Stay hidden unless I signal." Before Ellie could protest, Mason stepped from the forest edge, hands raised non-threateningly as he approached the perimeter. "Reed," he called. Guns swung toward him immediately. Lights blinding in the darkness. "Hold fire," Reed ordered, genuine surprise in his voice. "Harper, I thought you'd be miles from here by now." "This has gone far enough," Mason said, stopping at the edge of the clearing. "Your hunt is disrupting a delicate ecosystem and threatening a species that deserves protection, not exploitation." Reed studied him with narrowed eyes. "Interesting timing, Harper. I just received orders to terminate this operation from Willard." Reed nodded slowly. "Apparently some very influential people became aware of our activities here. People with government connections." Mason kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced with possibilities. "Then we have nothing to discuss. Take your team and leave these mountains." Reed's laugh held no humor. "Just like that. After what I've seen, what I know exists here." He pulled the satellite phone from his pocket, holding it like a weapon. "This order came because someone leaked information about our operation. But imagine if I were to call back with proof, with actual specimens. Reed, all it would take is one juvenile." Reed continued, voice low and intense. "One living example to validate everything. Willard would be forced to reconsider." "You're talking about kidnapping an intelligent juvenile being," Mason replied, disgust evident in his voice. "I'm talking about scientific discovery." Reed snapped. "Just like you used to pursue before you lost your nerve." A sound behind Reed drew their attention. The wounded creature stood at the opposite tree line, watching the confrontation with those intelligent eyes. It had clearly understood the plan had changed and was now improvising, creating a distraction to draw attention from the evacuation route. Reed turned slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "Perfect timing," he murmured, reaching for the tranquilizer gun leaning against a nearby equipment case. "No," Mason said firmly, stepping between Reed and the weapon. "This ends now." Reed's expression hardened. "Get out of my way, Harper. That specimen is my ticket to vindication. It's a living being with a family, a culture, a right to exist undisturbed. It's the discovery of the century," Reed countered. "Think about it. Your name could be attached to this. Your research validated. Everything you and your wife worked for, recognized at last." The mention of Sarah struck Mason like a physical blow. For a moment he felt the pull of that old ambition, the desire for recognition, for vindication after years of ridicule and dismissal. The creature watched him, somehow seeming to understand the choice Mason faced. It made no move to flee, standing its ground with dignified purpose. "Sarah wouldn't want this," Mason said finally. "She studied them to understand and protect, not to capture and display." Reed's patience visibly snapped. He shoved Mason aside, lunging for the tranquilizer gun. As his fingers closed around it, the creature made a sound, not threatening, but almost sorrowful. Mason looked at the magnificent being standing tall in the clearing, freely offering itself as a distraction to protect its family. In that moment, he made his choice. With a swift movement, Mason grabbed the satellite phone from Reed's pocket and retreated several steps. "Everyone, stop! Listen to me." Reed froze, the gun half raised. "What are you doing?" "Making the right choice," Mason replied, raising the phone. "This is Mason Harper. I need to speak to whoever issued the stand-down order." Reed's expression shifted from anger to alarm. I have information about the specimens you're seeking," Mason continued into the phone. "But I'm only sharing it under one condition. These mountains become a federally protected wilderness area. No development, no tourism, minimal human interference." The creature watched this exchange with evident comprehension, its intelligent eyes tracking between Mason and the phone he held. Reed lunged forward again. "Give me that!" The creature moved with surprising speed, placing itself between Reed and Mason in a clear, protective gesture. Reed stumbled backward, shock replacing anger as the implication of the creature's action registered. "You see?" Mason said into the phone. "They understand. They choose to protect those who protect them. I have decades of research documenting their intelligence, their social structures, their right to be classified as more than mere animals." The wounded creature approached Mason slowly, then did something that stopped every human heart in the clearing. It extended a massive hand toward the phone, clearly asking for it. Mason, acting on instinct rather than reason, handed it over. The creature raised the device to its face and made a series of deliberate vocalizations, complex, measured sounds unlike anything Reed's team had recorded. Then it carefully returned the phone to Mason's hand. Silence fell across the clearing as the implications of what they'd witnessed sank in. This wasn't just intelligence. This was communication, intention, purpose. "Who am I speaking with?" came a voice from the satellite phone, breaking the spell. What was that sound? Mason raised the phone again, his decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. That was the voice of a species asking for its freedom. "And I intend to make sure they get it." Dawn painted the mountains in soft gold as Mason stood on the cabin porch, watching the last of Reed's team load equipment into their vehicles. The helicopter had departed an hour earlier, carrying Reed himself back to face his disappointed backers at the Willard Institute. "Is it really over?" Jake asked, joining his father at the railing. Mason nodded, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "The area's being designated a protected wilderness preserve. No development, no logging, minimal human presence, because of what the creature did with the phone." "Partly," Mason acknowledged. "That recording is being analyzed by linguists now, but mostly because someone at the Department of Interior has been monitoring the Willard Institute's activities for years, waiting for them to overreach." Ellie emerged from the cabin, carefully carrying a smooth stone with unusual markings, a gift left on their doorstep during the night. "Do you think we'll see them again?" "I don't know," Mason answered honestly. "They've survived this long by staying hidden. That instinct won't disappear overnight." The family fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the morning mist rose from the valley below. Reed's vehicles disappeared around the mountain bend, leaving only disturbed dust as evidence they'd ever been there. "What will you do with Mom's research now?" Ellie asked finally. "With your own observations?" Mason considered the question carefully. "Document it, preserve it, but not publish, not yet. Some discoveries need to be protected more than proclaimed." Jake traced the markings on the stone Ellie held. "They trusted Mom. Now they trust us with their secret." "A heavy responsibility," Mason agreed. Movement at the forest edge drew their attention. There, partially concealed by ancient pines, stood the wounded creature they'd treated. Its injury was healing well, the bandages they'd applied now gone. Behind it, almost invisible unless you knew to look, several smaller figures waited in deeper shadow. Mason raised his hand in a simple gesture of acknowledgement. The creature returned the movement, then touched its chest in what seemed a gesture of gratitude, or perhaps farewell. "They're leaving this area," Ellie realized aloud. "Moving deeper into the mountains. A wise precaution," Mason said. "Even with official protection, word will spread. Curiosity seekers will come. The creature made no sound, but its gaze lingered on each of them in turn, before settling on Mason with an intensity that communicated across the species barrier. Then, with deliberate purpose, it placed something on a flat rock at the forest edge, before retreating into the shadows with its companions. When they were certain the creatures had gone, the family approached cautiously. On the rock lay a small object that caught the morning light, a pendant carved from some kind of stone attached to a woven cord of plant fibers. The design matched symbols from Sarah's research journals, concentric circles surrounding a diamond shape. "Mom had drawings of this," Jake said softly. "She called it a memory stone." Mason lifted it carefully, feeling unexpected emotion tighten his throat. The indigenous people she interviewed said these were given to trusted outsiders, those who shared knowledge with the forest guardians. Ellie touched the pendant gently. "They're acknowledging what we did, what Mom started, and entrusting us to continue protecting them," Mason added, slipping the cord over his head. The stone rested against his chest, cool at first, but quickly warming to his body temperature. They returned to the cabin in contemplative silence. Inside, Mason looked around at the familiar space with new eyes, seeing not just their home, but a continuation of Sarah's legacy. Her books still lined the shelves, her research notes carefully preserved, her spirit somehow more present than it had been in years. "What happens now?" Jake asked, voicing the question in all their minds. Mason smiled, feeling a sense of purpose he'd thought lost forever. "We keep living here, watching, learning, protecting in quiet ways, like guardians of the guardians," Ellie suggested. "Exactly like that," Mason agreed. Later, as afternoon shadows lengthened across their clearing, Mason sat at Sarah's old desk, opening a fresh journal. On the first page, he wrote simply, "They exist. They understand. They choose to remain legend." He paused, pen hovering over the paper, then added, "And we choose to help them remain so." Outside, the forest had returned to its normal rhythms, birds calling, squirrels chattering, wind rustling through pine needles. To casual observers, nothing would seem unusual about these mountains, these woods, this ordinary family living their quiet lives on the edge of wilderness, and that, Mason reflected as he closed the journal, was exactly as it should be. Some wonders deserve to remain just beyond the edge of common knowledge, not denied, but not defined either, existing in that liminal space between science and mystery where true respect could flourish. From the distant ridge came a single call, that distinctive vocalization that was neither quite human nor quite animal. A farewell, perhaps, or a reminder that they were never truly alone in these ancient forests. Mason stepped onto the porch, the memory stone warm against his skin, and raised his hand in silent acknowledgement of neighbors most would never know existed. The knowledge felt not like a burden, but a gift, one last shared discovery with Sarah, preserved not in academic journals, but in the hearts of those who understood the value of keeping some secrets. In the end, that was the greatest discovery of all.